Most of the time I just sit down cold and something comes to me, because writing it's just a way of seeing. And in that context, the how becomes trivial. How could you not have another idea for a single 1,000 word story each week? I mean, that's easy.
You were just listening to author Matt Gemmell. I'm Lee Schneider, and this is the Future Lab. The Future Lab tells the stories that shape the future. It's where thriller, science fiction, climate fiction, and fantasy authors discuss how we shape the future with the stories we tell today. Matt is the author of 4 books of fiction, including the popular Kestrel techno-thriller trilogy. He has also published 4 nonfiction books and 6 collections of short stories about the supernatural. Matt was once a software engineer doing design and user experience work for companies like Apple, and he approaches writing with an engineer's mind combined with the improvisational approach of a session musician. Toward the end of our conversation, we talk about Matt's writing setup, why he likes mechanical keyboards, and the pleasure he derives from a good e-ink tablet. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Matt Gemmell. So welcome, Matt. I wanted to ask first about the process of learning how to write while writing and the process of getting better through a trilogy.
I think this is one of these ones that's probably different for every writer, but for me, what I found, there's a term in evolution or evolutionary theory, I think. I'm not sure whether it's been discredited, and I'll probably misremember the term, but it's something like punctuated equilibrium. But the sense of it was that it's not a linear or even a smooth curve of improvement. There are these great accelerations, these inflection points. And I find that it's only after a full piece of work, let's say after a book, that I sort of disengage with the process enough to sort of consolidate the experience, and then I find that I feel I'm a little better by the next one. So there's this sense of being so, not mired in, because that sounds quite negative, but so engrossed and so encompassed in the work of an actual book that I think perhaps I at least only learn the lessons of it and improve after a major piece of work. So I find myself in this weird position of you finish a book and then there's all the stuff, not even the editing, but there's the beta readers and there's the cover stuff and the marketing, there's a billion things. So there's this huge span of time and completely unrelated activities after finishing the actual writing of a book before you come back to sit down and probably properly start a new one. And it's at that point that I realised I've actually learned something from this. Not on a chapter-to-chapter basis, but book to book.
I would say, and I've seen it in your writing, a kind of an elegance and an economy where you're doing just what you need to do, and you evoke a character or you evoke a scene, or I can live in the scenes. I sort of have a 3D view of the scenes, even though you've described them often sparely, but I just feel more present in the work, in your work, when I read, I'm reading, almost done with Jinx now. I just feel more present in the work, which is fun, and it's a tribute to that kind of learning process.
Well, I mean, that's kind of you. Thank you very much. I think it's kind of like, Bruce Lee had the 1-inch punch where he could concentrate all of the force. I mean, to whatever degree it's true.
Exactly.
Just in that short space. And it's like a paring down to the absolute essentials. It's a honing down to what is absolutely needed, and it's something that has to come about like muscle memory. It has to come about by just doing so much of it and figuring out what works for you and what resonates with you and with the reader, and how to just get to, as you say, the sort of core of a scene where everything contributes to it and nothing takes away from it. And I think the only way you can do it is by doing it so many times that it becomes habitual, and so much of it starts to cross over towards instinct. I think that's the thing with, that the great dichotomy of between writers is the plotters and the pantsers, the extensive planners and preparers, and those who they don't want to be hampered and constrained and restrained by having a big outline or whatever it is, and just want to tell the story. And it's a false distinction, because it makes the classic mistake we make in so many things. We believe, for example, that you need to have motivation to start writing, but you and I both know that you have to start writing in order to receive the motivation to keep going.
Right.
And it's exactly the same with instincts for storytelling or for anything else. You don't either start with them or not, in which case you can never be, say, a writer. You have to do it so much that you gain an instinct. I think instinct is just the creative faculty's equivalent of muscle memory. And I write these isolated, self-encapsulated scenes literally every week, in the sort of free weekly story, and I've done it for what's it been, 189 consecutive weeks now.
Amazing.
It'll be in another couple of days, but as long as I don't get COVID again, having had a bout with it recently, it'll be 190 consecutive weeks. And it would be a tragic thing indeed if I hadn't learned a bit about what goes into a scene. It's the way I think of it is it's theatre, because you've just got that little bit of the stage, and you've just got the lights that are there and the backdrop that's there, and all of the focus is on the actors, and you've got to make something of it. And what you've got to make is something that seems so much bigger than it actually is. And that's what a scene is. So in a way, I suppose I've given myself an unfair advantage just because I practice all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a music or something like that. And the music metaphor connects for me because it's kind of an improvisation within chord changes for me. You are breaking it down to the atomic level, the scene level, but somehow you get a sense of what scenes should be in and what scenes should be out and what order they come in. And I know you've written in your blog that sometimes you need just the first word, just the first sentence to launch. And I find that works for me pretty well, but I tend to write what I call a terrible movie treatment of the whole book. It's just awful. I just write, and then this happens, and then that happens, and then this happens, and sometimes character diaries, and it's unreadable to anyone else but me. But I kind of like to know generally where I'm going, and then I get rid of it. Then I rarely look at that. Occasionally, I will paste parts of it into what I'm working on, but most of the time, similarly to you, it's bullet points or maybe a sentence or two. My question is how do you, if you're going on the atomic level, how do you see the big picture, or do you need to? And how do you think in terms of, say, 3 books? The trilogy question.
Yeah, some good questions there. I think part of it does come back to this question of instinct. You often hear that the big question when you write books, how much do you need to pay attention to structure? And that is akin to the question of, are you a plotter or a pantser, and so on. There's a certain alignment between these concepts, say, of being a plotter and a preparer and an exhaustive bullet list maker, and paying attention to structure. And I find that when people ask you how much attention do you need to pay to structure, i.e. how much do you need to be keeping an eye on the big picture all the time, what they're sort of silently usually hoping is that you'll say, nah, you'll be fine, just carry on. Just as you want to sit down and get started, it'll all work out in the end. And that may well be the case. But again, it'll work out in the end because you are so intimately familiar with functional and effective structures that it seems like you are just letting the muse control your fingers and letting it pour out of you. But it doesn't come from nothing. I think it comes from reading. You know, you've read so much, not even necessarily written. You have to understand how to listen to music, say, and to understand the effects of different time signatures and chord progressions and transpositions and arrangements and all of it in order to begin to understand how to use those things yourself. You kind of have to appreciate beauty in order to sort of fumblingly begin to create it, and that applies to everything. We just tend to forget that reading is this universal thing we all do, but it happens to be storing up this incredibly useful insight and instinct for people who choose to write. So to answer the question a bit more directly, I keep an eye on the big picture, certainly recently, mostly in the sense of knowing what the structure of, say, a techno thriller is, because I've read so many and because I've read the previous ones. Comparing it to my first one, I had to be an awful lot more deliberate about keeping my eye on the big picture. And, you know, the classic 3-act structure, the 25-50 and the 25, and the inciting event and the reversal and the point of reaction, the half of the action, reaction that turns into action and all that stuff. And it's great and it absolutely totally works, and you can take any book or movie ever and you can pin it onto this template, you know, like a cookie cutter. You can cut out the jigsaw that makes it fit now. And that's absolutely fine. That's a fantastic tool. But you find after a while, as I imagine you probably have yourself, that you kind of know where the beats are. And you will find that a rhythm asserts itself in your writing, sort of subconsciously, because you know what you're expecting, both from long experience reading and to some extent writing. And you know that it works because you know why it works, because you've had the emotional response yourself. So I think that just as you say, that you learn through long practice to get inside of a scene and to pare it down to everything that functions for that scene, I think you can also apply that at the macro level to an entire plot of a novel. You just get a sense of where you are, and before very long, you can drop into any point of a book and you can feel the current of it, you know, while the tide's going out or coming in, and you just get a sense. And thankfully, a little bit down the road of writing the damn things, you can use that to guide you, because you always kind of can feel whether you're swimming upstream, you're swimming downstream, and that sort of thing.
I teach a class in media, and a lot of the folks who do that, they've never made a movie, they've never edited, and I will watch, and they will have a scene where someone walks through the scene, and they will cut at the perfect point when the person leaves the scene or the door closed. And I think, how do they know that? You know, I didn't say anything about cutting rhythm, but they've seen a lot of movies. And that's what's happening here with the writing, that we've read a lot of books or even experienced movies or whatever, plots, narrative. What's interesting to me that happens, and I'm curious if this happens to you, is I cultivate the time where I'm about to, in a literary way or in a writing way, I'm about to jump off a cliff, where I've deliberately written myself into a corner, or a character says something that is so ridiculous, impossible. You know, you have a character, Aldridge, who comes out with a lot of inappropriate, you know, his humor is definitely off base for that group, which is funny. But I'm thinking of people also who just come up with things that like, that seems really weird. And a lot of times I'll say, let's see if I can keep that. Let's see if that's not a bizarre offhand remark, but we actually can pursue that. Sometimes it doesn't work, but often I find that some of the best work I do is when I'm in distress in a way, or I've risked something. I've taken a big risk, and attempting to make it work closes a gap. Or a reader will read something and say, well, that doesn't make sense. I say, well, I'm not going to give that up, but now I'm going to make it make sense.
It's like improv in a way, you know. You get this kind of prompt
Yeah.
and you've got to work it in, or whose line is it anyway, or that kind of thing. When I'm doing the weekly story, it's only a tiny minority of the time that I'm starting with the first sentence. It's usually that I'm starting with just a word or a phrase or even an image in my mind, and I just know that it's going to crop up somewhere. I've got 1,000 words, 1,500 words, something like that. And just simply by having it hovering there, figuratively speaking, usually it's at the bottom because I write on top of my notes. You know, I put my notes down at the bottom, a few blank lines, and I start. So I'm always chasing the notes. And as I hit one of them, it goes away. So I've got this wall in front of me that I'm chipping through as I go. But most of the time, I think the prompt, the key idea, whatever it is, occurs because this is dramatically natural in the latter third, certainly, of the story. And it's just by having it hang around there, something happens in your mind. It's constantly reaching and trying to find the connections, the nodes that it can, pin together in order to get to that thing. So you go on these wonderful journeys because you've set this weird waypoint and your brain sort of has to navigate as you go with a view to hitting that point, It does make me think of you're mapping something in the car on the sat nav, and if it's one of those annoying ones where you're not just going to a destination, you have to go via an intermediate place first, like you need to get some milk on the way to whatever. So you've got this waypoint and you see the way the route deviates. It's exactly like that. You just get started at a place that is nice and familiar, home or the blank page or the blank screen. And at the end of it, you need to have a scene or a chapter or a book or something like that. And you set this weird and wonderful waypoint, and your brain invariably will find a way to route you via that, whether explicitly or in some subtle, obscure way. I think those can be the most fun types of writing sessions. That's pretty much what things like prompt cards and, you get these decks of cards with...
Yes.
That's pretty much what that is. It's sort of throwing a seed, sometimes like a hand grenade. Sometimes it's a helping hand, sometimes it's a grenade. It depends.
Right.
But
sometimes a grenade, yeah.
it's like leg day as well. It's forcing you to use certain muscles and to develop a more kind of rounded ability.
Do you find it's easy to do this with plot in a way? Like, I'll think of this crazy thing and we'll close this loop. It's harder to do with a satisfying character arc because, let's face it, even in techno thrillers, even in the most technical plot-driven thing, if the characters aren't satisfying or they don't have something happen to them that's satisfying, no one's going to finish reading the book. They may give it a try. You may have a great inciting incident, but I find one of the hardest things to do is to actually see the arc that the characters should go through emotionally before I write it. I'll write the whole thing and someone will say, that doesn't work because they fell in love too fast, or that doesn't work because they should hate each other and you didn't talk about that. And I outrun the feelings that the characters actually could have. In other words, I could go to a certain point and then I could actually stop and say, all right, guys, how's it going? What did I miss? Asking the characters in a sense, or asking a reader. Have you had that kind of experience?
I'm always very guilty of wanting the characters to reach a certain point of personal development as quickly as possible, and I think that has its core in being a romantic, to be honest. Because whether or not it's actually a romantic relationship or a romantic subplot, That is the structure of it. It's the wish for realization or fulfillment or completion or something like that. That kind of cluster of meaning. But what I find, this would be my grumpy old man thing with writing. The one thing I cannot abide, I don't care how crazy the plot is. I don't care how silly the names of the damn characters are, or where it's set, or what happens, or the genre, or anything. But I cannot abide characters that do not seem to be internally consistent. You know, they don't seem to be real people, even if the setting is outlandish. Within the universe and the constraints of the story and its world, that they don't seem to be real people. And it is so, I'd have to say, irritating, because the one thing we all know is people. You know, we've been surrounded by people our entire lives, interacting with them and all their nuance and bizarreness and so on. And we just have this necessary for survival, incredibly advanced sense of when someone is behaving consistently or deceptively, or when they're feeling certain emotions or whatever. And it's like a state machine in computing. You really can drop in on a character at any point and predict, given the situation they're in, how they're likely to respond. And a character arc is actually just a whole bunch of that. It's a whole bunch of reactions and actions in context, which takes them on their own inevitable journey. And I think if I had to give a piece of advice to people who find themselves struggling with that, I would say stop thinking about the arc like it's a tram line or a roller coaster, this fixed thing, these metal rails that a person has to be dragged along. Instead, create the character and let them react and act and respond and think and feel, and they will end up where they're supposed to be, and the reader will absolutely believe it because it's a real person.
I know you do some woodworking and some projects, and you post on Mastodon about those. And I just wanted to know, is there any relationship, strained metaphors allowed between woodworking and writing for you?
Well, God, I mean, a writer can construct a analogy between any two damn things, particularly two things they enjoy doing. If I had to be honest, certainly both of these pursuits share the property that it's usually a lot more fun to plan and set up and get the gear together than it is to do the damn thing. And it takes a whole lot longer than you think it's going to take. And the results at first are much less pleasing than you would have hoped. I suppose if I was answering that question in front of a class of bright-eyed, young, optimistic people, I might say things about patience being a virtue in both and all that sort of thing, and there being an aesthetic quality, a beauty and a value in the making of the thing, regardless of any sort of external judgment of standard. And I think that's very true. I mean, my son likes to come and help Daddy in the woodworking sheds, obviously with substantial limitations in terms of keeping him safe, but he'll knock together a couple of little rough scraps, and I mean, my God, there's beauty in that for me as his father, even though it's something anyone else would glance at and quickly chuck in the scraps bin. And there is also absolutely a beauty and a pride and a joy of the making and of the sort of exertion of one's creative faculty upon the world. Regardless of how many wiggly red underlines there are in the work at the end of it, or whether anyone else ever reads it. I think ultimately the question of the question of the comparative properties and values of doing a thing has to bring us back to this core idea that making a table or a shelf or writing a novel or a symphony has to be primarily motivated by you wanting to and needing to do it, rather than wanting to have the thing and see how people respond to it. You know, it really better be about the doing it, because otherwise I think that's a pathway to a lack of fulfillment, I think, and inevitable disappointment, probably.
Do you feel that thrillers and techno thrillers need a formula to succeed? Are there rules in the genre that you feel you have to meet or might even be constrained by?
I would say that techno thrillers, like many genres, but I think techno thrillers are maybe closer to the front half of this, with the frontmost position definitely being occupied by romance. There is a strong expectation on the part of the reader. Whether the writer interprets that as having to write to a formula is a different question, of course. But ultimately, the second goal after doing the thing of writing a book is to have it read. So there is there's certainly a good argument for considering whether you're going to meet the reader's expectation. But of course, you can violate the reader's expectation and give them something that they love nonetheless, and that they discover that they love. So if you feel that you're writing one of these things in whatever genre and you're wanting to go against the grain because you feel you have a good reason for it and it's integral to the story and to the art of the thing, then my God, I wouldn't worry about that. But the bigger question, I think, is what do people mean by formula? You know, and to me, it's like it's setting off my spidey sense again for these people who are plotters or pantsers, and how do you keep an eye on the big question? It's again, we keep coming back to this issue of the elephant in the room of structure, you know, because what is formula if not an extremely specific instance of a particular structure? My answer would be, I mean, I get to give a sort of cheaty, artistic, slightly sideways answer because you asked me, you know, and I'm speaking. So
it's my fault. I take responsibility.
Thank you, thank you. What I would say is that in pretty much all things, formula or planning or template or whatever you call it is useful, but it's much, much, much less important than something which can sometimes seem like it's formula: intention, being deliberate about something. You will always, always, always get better results in anything by doing it deliberately and for a reason, i.e. with forethought of some kind. That forethought doesn't have to be, how can I make my story adhere to the 3-act structure or the formula for a techno thriller or whatever it is. But if you do something without a reason, you just simply won't, unless you're just by dumb luck, you won't achieve that internal integrity, which I think is the thing readers actually like in stories. And I think that formulas for particular genres are just, they're like evolutionarily developed structures that happen to work, so we come back to them, not because the structure itself or the formula is the only one, but because they are so intentional in what they do. And you can absolutely look at the classic structure for a romance novel, a techno thriller, whatever it might be, and look at it from the perspective of everything has its purpose and is done for a very good reason in the story, and that's why it works. So that's the lesson to learn. Not I have to do this formula and be constrained, but everything that I do has to be for a reason, not just because that's how someone else does it. I think intentionality is the sort of the meta formula, if you will, And it's the one that allows you to throw away some of these shackles if you see it that way and still write a damn good story that resonates with the reader because you meant it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very informative, if someone's thinking about writing a book like this, that's a very useful, informative way to think about it. There are structures. I'll give an example I've seen a few times in your books. There'll be a new chapter. There'll be a character who is lovingly described, who I've never met before. And I know that person's going to die, like maybe just 2 pages down in some spectacular way. And that's a structure, but what happens there is, as the reader who knows a bit about, has read books like this, I relax. I say, Matt's got me here. I know where this is going. And this is going to be good for these next few pages because my expectations are going to be met. And it's just the same as when I read, my wife reads a lot of beach reads, what are called beach reads here. And it's intentionality to the max with those. When I've read them, everything is there for a reason. Nothing is wasted. They have a feign or faked casualness, but they are not casual books at all. They're probably more precise than anything I've ever written in the beats that they hit. Maybe not in the order every time, but the beats that they hit. So these structures coming at them, you think of someone like Raymond Chandler, who broke every rule you could think of and then became the rule. And when people try to write like Raymond Chandler, as I did in my early writing career, usually fail because I'm not Raymond Chandler. He invented something. He was the outlier who became the insider. And because a few great films were made of his books, we remember it as kind of a template. But it would be scary, but probably accurate to say there really is no fixed template. There's just writing with intention.
I mean, I hope there's no fixed template. That would be an indication of an exhaustion of something that I hope is infinite. Inventiveness, human creativity. Going back to those scenes you mentioned there. How I think of those. In my notes, I refer to them as the halftime show because the main characters are off the stage. Some new people come in very temporarily, and a little thing happens. What I also use them to do, and if you ever happen to read back over the books, you'll notice this straight away now that I've said it, is that I try to make it emblematic of the entire plot in miniature. Wow. It's the sort of whole thing happening in just a scene or so with a completely disposable, as you say, temporary character. And it's a wee bit of playtime, not just for the writer, but for the audience, because you don't have to have read another one of my books, I think, to recognise the shape of that. It's something that just comes from reading in general. I think even if you weren't fully conscious that you knew what was coming, there's that certain sense, this is a brand new name and it's past a certain point in the plot, and it would be artless to introduce a important character this late. Like, this person's probably getting a bullet within the next 2 or 3 pages. But yeah, it's sort of another way to show what the book is about by taking the larger plot elements and zooming straight into a single person, and you've got 5 pages or whatever it is. This is what happens in this book, by the way, and then you come back to our movie already in progress sort of thing. So yeah, it can serve multiple functions, and it's an example of as you say, doing something very deliberately, even if the reader, isn't necessarily immediately aware of that being its purpose. Always do things with a reason. I always feel I'm maybe a wee bit guilty of doing things with too many reasons. The colours of the book covers that you and I spoke about before we started recording, and I do this thing that I think of as bookends, where there's a mirrored passage from very early in the book to very late in the book, and all of this playful stuff that you get to do when it's your own train set and you control the whole thing. But yes, if I'd felt constrained by the strictures of any particular very specific formula, I wouldn't have these things. And I think that my writing experience and the books would be the poorer for it.
I wanted to ask, toward that kind of palate cleansing idea, you've written so many of these stories, the weekly stories, and now you're making videos going back to the beginning and reading them, which must be, I would think, really instructive for you, and I could tell kind of moving for you, kind of a moment to come back to that. We talked a bit about the creative reason for doing that. I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit, because it's kind of amazing that you've done so many and they're all different, and you explore something else in each one. So how and why are you able to pull that off?
How is scheduling, of course. If you're going to do something every single week and you don't want to miss a week, as you know better than I think you got to make the time. And you have to set the time. Setting the time is even more important than making the time. You find that if you set the time, then you're able to make the time, but perhaps not vice versa. The how is, well, it's the great question, isn't it? I think that the how is just that there is no predefined limitation on inspiration for things. When you decide that you're a writer, and it is simply a matter of deciding, it's a self-certified thing. There's no issuing authority for the credentials, thank God. Right. And you should never give anyone else the power to decide whether you have those credentials, of course. But when you decide that you're a writer and you start writing, even those, jealously guarded, embarrassing private scribblings in the anonymously named folder on your computer or whatever it is, the fan fiction, the extra scenes from TV shows you like, however it is you start, what you find is that there's a shift in your perspective, there's a shift in your mindset, and you see the world in a different way. You see it as a whole bunch of little things that sort of prompt that little prickle in your mind that says this could be a story. And once you've had that shift in perspective, that opening of the third eye, or however you want to present it, you realise that the actual situation is that you will never have enough time in your life to write about all the ideas for stories that present themselves to you every single day. It's like, I don't know if you read Wyndham's The Chrysalids, about the psychic children, and once it sort of switches on, it becomes a flood and you have to shut it off, all these thought shapes from other people all the time. That's what it's like. It's not scrabbling for inspiration, it's which of these many things do I write about. And I do keep little notes of the things that occur to me, literally, as you and I have spoken about before, just a word, a phrase, a description of an image that was in my mind, even a single piece of dialogue, something that someone says. I've no idea who, I've no idea where, when, but that's all it is. And I can jot down, 10 of them in a day. That won't be every day, but my goodness, it's more than enough to keep me going. And only about maybe 50 or 60% of the time when I sit down to do the story for the following week, do I even dig into those. Most of the time I just sit down cold and something comes to me, because writing it's just a way of seeing. And in that context, the how becomes trivial. How could you not have another idea for a single 1,000 word story each week? I mean, that's easy.
I enjoyed the story you told in one of your YouTube videos of seeing a character who later plays a major role in the book, and you saw this person, and you actually ran into this person again a later time. And it's fascinating to me that things like that happen, that you may see a person, you say, yep, we just had the casting session, and you've been cast. It's an amazing, strange event.
Casting is exactly the right word, because I think it's the same thing that people are doing when they, sort of spot people on the street and offer them a modelling contract or whatever. It's
Right.
they are professionally looking differently at the things we're all looking at. And so they see something different. They see a potential that doesn't occur to other people, and they can take that and draw it out. And I think it's exactly the same. It's the same way that I don't know, a musician hears a snippet of a melody in the blowing of the wind through the trees or something, and that could be something, and they noodle something out on a MIDI app on their phone and then lay it down, or pull out a voice recorder and chuck in some lyrics that they've heard some guy say. I mean, I'm a huge Dire Straits and Mark Knopfler since then fan, and I mean, Money for Nothing, all that fabulous, all those wonderful lyrics. It was a guy in a appliance store in New York that Knopfler happened to be in. Look at them yo-yos, and MTV was in one of the tellies, and Knopfler's songwriting ear just heard it. And you and I would hear I think he did actually have a cigar in his mouth, some big Brooklyn guy mouthing off at these people musicians on MTV, but Knopfler heard a song. And similarly, you can see someone in the street or see a situation and you can see a story. Or someone who should be modelling clothes for one of the magazines or whatever, you're seeing it differently. A location scout for movies, it's exactly the same thing. You just get into this mindset where you see the creative potential in something that we've all kind of just trained ourselves to ignore.
For the first book, I saw this scene in my mind of someone knocking down a building with a kind of a plasma gun called a demolator. And it wasn't part of a novel yet, it wasn't anything. And I played in my mind over and over and over, building and building and building on the scene. And I would think of it when I was running. And later I put it into the novel and I realized, no, that's not really the right thing. But at least it got me going. The characters showed up. I didn't know that at the time. So, yeah, these things that appear are pretty strange, interesting. It's kind of like what I think of as the channeling part of it, or the tapping into something bigger than me or whatever.
I would have to say that it may have, I couldn't say myself, but it may have something in common with people who would ascribe a spiritual property to certain experiences, and the feeling figuratively of a hand upon their shoulder steering them a certain way. Not to demean those experiences for people who have them and for whom they have enormous significance and value, but I think it is not dissimilar, at least, to just see in that different way that sort of sparks a creativity.
And a flow state, being able to cultivate the flow state and just go there. What does your writing setup look like? And we'll have a picture that you graciously provided. And I know you've custom designed the keyboard, and you have a very specific setup that's different from others that I've seen. So could you describe it?
Yeah, so I have to say this in the tone of someone who is sadly confessing to a substance abuse problem. I have gone deep down the rabbit hole of mechanical keyboards. So I've got one of these ergonomic splits, 2-section keyboards, from which I've changed the switches for a different feel and removed keys and blanked off the top of them and made a custom map and all that sort of stuff. So heavily into that. I mean, what I like most about it is that you can spend so much time on that stuff that you would otherwise have to spend writing and doing something productive. So it really ticks all the boxes in that regard. But I've got the two halves of the keyboard. I've got a magic trackpad in between because I use an iPad full time. I don't use a sort of computer. And I got a sort of standard desk that's one of these electric rise and sit and stand desks. But I built a keyboard in the musical sense shelf that onto the underside of it, so that slides out for when I'm making music and doing some music production in Logic. I have of course recently added some very fancy camera equipment for the aforementioned reading, doing the story readings and doing a bit more YouTube stuff. So I've got a, terrifying tripod mounted big black eye staring at me over here, and various desk mounts and so on. I, of course, keep my books, the ones that I've written myself, stacked up on my desk so that they can frown at me disapprovingly when I'm not writing the next one. and one thing I absolutely love is my an e-ink tablet. Have you gotten into these things at all? Yeah.
I've played around, not with the one of the quality you have. I have an iPad and some software with some pretty good handwriting recognition, but you've brought it to a much higher level.
I've got a pretty fancy one. I just find that there's this ineffable sense of constraint that comes from trying to work out an idea on the screen. There's something about just it's in front of you and there's the box and you're typing in text, and it's very committed and it's very extant in the world. It's like it takes on a solidity that you really don't want it to have for most of the stages of the creative process. Whereas pen and paper, by contrast, because of its roughness, because of its imperfection, there's a plasticity, I suppose, that is really, really conducive to the there are no bad ideas, let's just work this thing out sort of thing. The problem with pen and paper, of course, is that there's no opportunity to buy an expensive electronic toy. So the perfect bridge of those two worlds is these e-ink tablets. So it's e-ink like any e-ink Kindle or Kobo or a book reading device, but larger. The one I've got sort of 10.3 inches, so iPad-ish sort of size. And it has that, of course, that glorious contrast and that crispy e-ink quality, and it's incredibly responsive. I mean, the screen refresh is slow because it's not a fancy computer, but my primate brain believes when I'm writing on it that I'm writing on paper, so my shoulders are down and my neck is loose and I can just scribble things out, but I can also move stuff about and correct mistakes and get it onto the actual computer later. And there's just something so very, very powerful about it. It absolutely enhances the kind of sense of repercussion-free creative freedom. And I mean, my wife isn't even here in the room, so I'm being genuine about that and not just saying it to justify a purchase. No, I love these things. I think they're a bit of a superpower, to be honest. I would strongly encourage people who feel that same thing, that they're just a little handcuffed trying to work out difficult things, stuff like, character biographies and arcs and plots and all that stuff, just trying to get a sense or figure out what is this thing actually about. There's nothing like paper, but the paper no longer has to be of the made from trees variety. So no, it's a key thing. Just having somewhere that you can look away from the screen, grab a writing implement and scribble something down. It's just so liberating. I would definitely encourage anyone to give that a go. Also, it's a shiny gadget.
I bought these Leuchtturm notebooks, which are pretty pricey, but I like the feel of them, and I like scribbling with smudgy pencils and things like that, because sometimes when I'm typing, I feel like I'm still setting type in a linotype machine or something. It feels archaic. even though I'm a fast typist, it's like I'm setting type, and it's also very noisy. I too have a mechanical keyboard,
Good man.
and I actually had to swap out the whole key set because it was too loud. I had a lot of complaints from my wife and son because when I get going, I type hard. I learned on typewriters, so I make a lot of noise. So I had to actually swap out for a quieter set.
That's exactly what I did. I mean, you're a mechanical keyboards guy, so you know there's the three categories. There's the clicky, snick, 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 snick. There's the tactile ones that do bump but are quiet-ish, and there's the linear ones that just go straight up and down, the latter of those being the quietest. And I had to, for the same reason, find the lightest activation weight linears that would go into this keyboard. And even then, if I'm in the flow or just angry about something, you can still make a hell of a noise with it.
Right. Oh, I make a lot of noise, especially when I'm wearing noise-canceling headphones and they're canceling out the sound of the keyboard. Or, my other habits are talking to myself, and I'm told that I tap my foot, kind of like a horse. Let's go, let's go, let's go.
I'm a finger drummer on the desk.
Yeah.
Terrible finger drummer. But we all have our vices and our bad habits and so on. Yes.
Right. Well, it's all part of the flow. And Matt, where can people find you online?
Yeah, do please feel free to check out my website. It's mattgemmell.scot, because I'm Scottish and just love the conceit of having a national top-level domain for that, just to make it difficult. .com will work as well, right enough. I've got a horror novel out. I've got some compendiums of those weekly short stories, and of course that techno thriller trilogy so far series that we have touched upon. You can find them in all online bookstores, and indeed the physical bookstores can order them for you as well. And if you would like to get a mini story in your email each week, or have it read to you on YouTube, as I've recently started, as you mentioned, do please have a look. The series is called Once Upon a Time.
We will put all of those links in the show notes, and when I send this out on the various socials like Mastodon. Where can you be found on Mastodon? Because you're quite active there.
Yes, I am Matt Gemmell at the mastodon.scot server, coincidentally, not coincidentally at all, very deliberately. I do have a Twitter account at Matt Gemmell, or X, I suppose I should say now, but for reasons that I'm sure are obvious, I'm much less active there lately. But all of the social links are on my website as well.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. It's great to speak with you again.
It's been an absolute delight once again, Lee. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Future Lab today. Please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the podcast. If you have some comments for me, go to memo.fm/thefuturelab and record them. I may play them on a future episode. That's memo.fm/thefuturelab. See you next time. I'm Lee Schneider, Artistic Director at FutureX.